French knight collapsed into the mud, breath shattered, fingers clawing at the cold earth. Ahead of him, no English line, only a silent killing field, as if the enemy had vanished into the soil. Behind him, screams drowned in mud, armor clashing, horses crying as if torn from their souls. The finest warriors of France, frozen in a narrow valley, before an army one-third their size. At Agincourt, the ground itself chose who lived and who died. And the reason why begins with a brutal truth. An anonymous chronicler in Gesta Henrici Quinti called this the march of men with nothing left to lose. But the paradox is this: Henry was not strong. France weakened itself. On the eve of battle, factions divided, nobles fought for command, and no voice united the host. The largest army in Europe marched into a death trap forged by pride. So how did they weaken themselves? Why did an elite army walk into a trap, visible from miles away? The chronicles offer clues, but to see the whole picture, we must return to Henry, to the scar from Shrewsbury, and to a war he could not afford to lose. Europe in the early 15th century, fractured under the weight of the 100 Years' War and political division. In this turmoil, Henry of Lancaster rose to the throne in 1413, carrying the ambition to assert his legitimacy over England and his claim to the French crown under the Salic Law. When he sailed from Southampton in August 1415, he was only 29, his face marked by the scar from Shrewsbury in 1403. A battle where an arrow nearly ended his life before it truly began. Henry believed that a decisive victory in France could reshape the balance of power across Europe. But after landing, the siege of Harfleur dragged on for nearly a month. Dysentery ravaged the English ranks, claiming hundreds of lives. The survivors marched on trembling legs, hungry, fevered, chilled to the bone, fighting sickness more than the enemy. Many veteran longbowmen could barely draw the great bows that once defined their strength. And yet, in this state of exhaustion, Henry chose to push deeper into France. Why would a young king, with a diseased and starving army, gamble the fate of an entire realm? Harfleur, the great port of Normandy, endured a siege from August 18th to September 22nd, 1415, before finally falling into Henry's hands after more than a month of brutal attrition. But inside those damp walls, dysentery erupted like a plague, claiming nearly one-third of Henry's forces, turning victory into a wound that bled strength from his army. Unable to hold the port, and with no reinforcements crossing the channel, Henry was forced to abandon Harfleur on October 8th, marching his battered men 260 kilometers toward Calais, the last English stronghold in France. But the French were waiting. They sealed every crossing of the Somme, driving Henry through ruined villages, shattered bridges, and mud that clung to every step like a curse. On October 24th, as Henry reached Agincourt, a French host of 20 to 30,000 men closed around him. Henry had only two choices: surrender or fight. And he chose to fight. Among the exhausted ranks, a nameless longbowman stood frozen in the morning mud. His hands were swollen, cracked, and bleeding. After weeks of drawing a longbow, requiring 45 to 55 kilograms of force, exactly as Mike Lodes documented in his studies of medieval warbows. His fingers trembled each time they brushed the string, not from the cold rolling out of the Tramecourt woods, but from a fear no one dared to speak aloud. He wore no shining armor, no noble crest, only numb feet, a frayed strap, and a hope thinner than his own breath. Only one question echoed in his mind: would he live to see the sun set? And he had no idea that the same mud clinging to his boots would soon become the weapon that saved his life against the strongest army in Europe. while the nameless longbowman stood frozen in the cold mud. The field before him had already transformed into a trap few recognized. Agincourt stretched 700 to 1,000 meters across, but narrowed sharply toward the English line, forming a deadly funnel. To the left stood the Tramacourt Woods, to the right, the Agincourt Woods, two green walls squeezing any advancing army into a single, choking corridor. On the night of October 24th, heavy rain fell, turning freshly plowed earth into 15 to 30 centimeters of clinging mud. Exactly as Anne Curry's battlefield analysis describes. And inside that funnel, Henry formed his 6,000 men into a broad V, men-at-arms in the center, 5,000 longbowmen embracing the flanks. Before them, thousands of angled stakes jutted from the ground, a forest of sharpened wood built to impale charging cavalry. They were not the strongest army, but they were the only army that understood the land beneath their feet. And where the English merely sank, the French would drown. Yet the question that stunned history remains. Why did a force of seasoned nobles fail to see the death trap opening before them? While Henry could read every contour of the muddy field, on the opposite side, France placed its fate in the hands of men whose names were greater than their battlefield instincts. At the front stood Constable Charles d'Albret, alongside the Duke of Alençon, Jean Le Mangre Boucicaut, and the Duke of Brabant, commanders convinced that noble blood and overwhelming numbers would decide the day. But pride became their undoing. Hundreds of knights fought for the honor of standing in the front line. For at Agincourt, the man who led the charge would claim both glory and the richest ransoms. No one stepped back. No one yielded position. And the column, already too wide, compacted into a suffocating mass inside the natural funnel. They dismissed the English archers, believing French armor to be untouchable. They believed cavalry speed would crush resistance. Forgetting heavy horses cannot charge when the mud rises to their ankles. Between the tightening woods, the elite of France packed themselves into a single doomed wedge. And then, the first command rang out. The moment the order sounded, thousands of bowstrings drew tight, releasing a cold, tearing hum across the French morning sky. 5,000 English archers loosed 6 to 12 arrows a minute, meaning that in the opening moments alone, more than 30 to 50,000 arrows filled the air, exactly as Warbow's research estimates. The narrow bodkin heads sliced forward like steel needles, piercing joints, armpits, visor slits, every weakness in French armor. French horses panicked instantly, slipping in the 15 to 30 centimeter mud, throwing knights to the ground, trampling their own riders in blind terror. The front line shattered, collapsing backward into the packed ranks behind. Metal screamed beneath the storm of arrows, and each step forward cost another knight, another fallen horse, another widening pool of blood on the choking field. But this was only the beginning of the collapse. When the first wave of French cavalry was crushed into Agincourt's mud, a brutal truth emerged, sharper than any legend Hollywood ever sold. French knights carried 25 to 30 kilograms of plate armor. And once they fell, the thick mud pinned their legs as if the earth itself refused to release them. The men in the rear could not see the front collapse, and wave after wave kept pushing into the narrowing funnel. They stepped on fallen comrades, pressed bodies into the ground, and many knights did not die by the sword, but by suffocation. Their lungs crushed inside the very armor meant to protect them. There were no glorious spinning sword blows, only steel grinding on steel, cries for help buried beneath the muck, and human bodies breaking under the weight of other men. When the last arrows left the strings, the English threw their bows aside. They drew hammers, maces, and misericord daggers, weapons designed for a single purpose: to find the gaps in armor and finish those too exhausted to rise. Then they plunged into the churning mass of bodies and mud, fighting at arm's length, where every swing struck flesh, metal, or both. In the chaos, another tragedy unfolded. The Duke of York, a cousin of the king, was knocked down by the press of his own men and trampled to death where he fell. A cruel reality that few heroic songs ever dare to describe honestly. And yet, amid the screams and the blood-soaked mud, Henry still held one final move in reserve. While the French heavy line struggled in a rising sea of mud and collapsing horses, something almost invisible began to move. Along both flanks, England's longbowmen, farmers with torn hands and hollow eyes, quietly slipped forward through the shadows of Tramecourt and Agincourt forest. They advanced meter by meter until the distance shrank to barely 20-30 meters, a range so close they could hear the breath of French knights through their visors. From that range, Bodkin arrows were no longer just arrows. They were armor breakers. They punched through eye slits, armpits, joints once thought impenetrable by the finest French armorers. At this distance, steel stopped being protection and became a trap. When their arrow bags finally emptied, the longbowmen did not fall back. They dropped their bows into the mud, drew hammers, mauls, and misericord daggers, and charged into the French flanks like two iron doors slamming shut. Ahead of the French, the mud held their feet like chains. Behind them, the rear ranks crashed forward, crushing their own men in blind panic. On both sides, England's lightly armored fighters carved through the mass inch by inch, a force that seemed the weakest on the field. It was now breaking the strongest army in Europe. And as the French line buckled under its own weight, the battle was far from over. As Henry's archers closed the trap from both flanks, the French vanguard began to crumble. They did not fall for lack of courage, but because 30 kilos of armor dragged them deeper into the mud, turning every step into a sentence. Names that once shook Europe. Dukes, marshals, knights in full plate, vanished beneath a storm of steel and wet earth. Men fell so quickly that the ground became a twisted carpet of armor and broken bodies. By the end, France had lost between 6,000 and 10,000 men, many of them among the highest nobility of the Valois realm. At the very front, Henry fought like an ordinary soldier. Mud clung to his cloak. His steel crown was dulled with dirt. Yet he stood in line to steady men who were close to breaking. And there, the Duke of Alençon charged like the final fury of France, bringing an axe down on Henry's head. The blow dented the crown, sent Henry staggering, and for a heartbeat, England stood one breath away from losing its king. Only the desperate blades of his bodyguards prevented that fate. But Alençon's fall unleashed something worse. The French rear, with no room to advance and no space to retreat, pressed forward in panic. Men shoved men, knights trampled their own. Screams merged with the grinding of metal and the suffocating weight of bodies. It happened like a dam bursting, the entire French line collapsing in a single terrible moment. Yet Agincourt was not finished with Henry. From behind, a cry rang out. A French detachment had ridden around and was attacking the English baggage camp. Henry turned toward thousands of noble prisoners bound on the field. Men who, if they broke free, would become a second army inside his own. And he made the harshest decision of the battle. He ordered the prisoners executed, not out of hatred, but out of fear of being crushed between two French forces. Many English soldiers hesitated, as the Gesta Henrici Quinti records, because they were raising blades against men they had long admired. But the order stood, and, in the chaos of Agincourt, it was carried out quickly, coldly, and without pause. Henry had secured victory. But the moral price of that choice would follow him for the rest of his life. When the morning mist finally lifted from Agincourt, Europe saw the true cost of victory. Between 6,000 and 10,000 French soldiers lay scattered across the mud, many of them among the highest nobles of the Valois realm, while English losses barely reached a few hundred, depending on which chronicle survived the centuries. That disparity shook the continent, because it shattered a myth that had endured for generations. The armored knight, long hailed as the unbreakable symbol of medieval warfare, had been brought down not by chivalry's opposite, but by mud, discipline, and the English longbow. From that day on, the longbow was no longer just a weapon. It became the ultimate force multiplier of the 14th and 15th centuries. Agincourt did not end on that field. It opened the road to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, where Henry V was recognized as the lawful heir to the throne of France, reshaping the destiny of two kingdoms. That day, Henry did more than win a battle. He proved that reading the ground could outweigh the weight of numbers, and Agincourt became a masterclass in military truth. That terrain beats quantity, that discipline conquers pride, and that technology matters only when used in the right place at the right moment. But beyond strategy, Agincourt carved a deeper lesson into history, that victory does not always belong to the strongest, but to those with no road left behind them. That war carries no glory, only a cost paid by both sides. And that the most heroic pages ever written were written in the blood of men whose names have long been forgotten. As the echoes of Agincourt fade into the past, what remains is not triumph, but a warning. That any army can be undone by its own pride. That any kingdom can fall blind to its own weaknesses. And that the fate of nations is often decided in the single moment when those truths collide. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, leave a small mark beneath this video. A comment, a like, a share. That is how history lives on, carried by those who choose to witness it. And if you are ready for the next chapter, stay with us. There are battles yet to be told, empires yet to rise and fall, and steel yet to ring across the centuries.